Welcome to this author's interview series. My name is Christina Theodoraki. I'm editor of Small Business Economics and Entrepreneurship Journal, and I have the great honor to interview today Danny Chung from California State University in Chico. Welcome, Danny, and thank you very much for accepting to give this interview about your paper and sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you for having me. This is a great opportunity, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about the paper.
So Danny is going to give us more insight on his paper entitled Founder Affiliations, Job Seeker Reactions, and the Impact on Employee Recruitment by Startup Ventures. This paper is published in Small Business Economics in October 2022. This paper is also co-authored with Simon Parker from EV Business School. So we'll start, Danny, my first question. Can you describe us what is the paper about?
Sure thing. So, in short, our paper looks at the effect of having a founder who's affiliated with these prestigious institutions, such as a very well-known school or a prestigious employer. And we do that in the context of hiring employees. And because while we sometimes hear news stories about startup employees who are able to become millionaires, the reality is that most startups end up closing down. So from the job seeker's perspective, uh, it's important to pick out the startups that are likely to do well in the future because it can mean the difference between becoming a millionaire or becoming unemployed. But when we think about it, it's really hard for job seekers to pick out good startups because most startups are private firms, so they have very little publicly available information. So in this case, in this paper, we argue that the institutions associated with the founders' education and also their employment background can serve as very important and valuable signals that can affect job seekers and how they evaluate a startup in terms of its attractiveness. And then we conduct a series of randomized experiments to establish causal evidence of the effects and the benefits of having such prestigious credentials. And then we also look at underlying mechanism behind these effects.
Thank you very much for providing this description. And actually, it's a $1 million question to find who will be the important ventures and how startups will survive, and actually how we can select which one will thrive in the future. So we can understand why it is important to find the successful startups or high growth firms. However, can you describe us what is important, the employee recruitment process and the effect on this success? And actually, why your article is important and what we learn more from what we already know from the literature?
Yeah, so I mean, that is, I guess, the $1 million question in terms of research is why, what's so important about our paper. So I think one kind of major important contribution it makes is that it really shifts the spotlight from fundraising to this context, which is employee recruitment. So while many scholars have examined the role of signals and how audiences use publicly available information to evaluate startups, most of the research has been conducted in the context of fundraising. So they study different types of investors, like angel investors, VC investors, and IPOs as well. But when we look around, I think one aspect that entrepreneurs cite as just as important or even more important or challenging than fundraising is in the areas of finding talent and recruiting talent. And in this paper, what we do a bit differently from the previous paper is that we highlight this recruitment as a very important context and show that even young job seekers, so these are not complex institutional investors, but these are very young individual job seekers, but even them, they have very complex decision-making process where they actively use signals to evaluate different employers. And then specifically, we show that having a founder with these prestigious credentials can not only help them attract job seekers, but allow startups to potentially hire them at a lower cost, so allowing them to save on financial capital as well. And then in terms of adding to the signaling literature, now I think what makes this context really interesting is that unlike investors who mainly are after financial returns, so therefore they only care or mostly care about the quality of startups as a company at the firm level, employees of startups are kind of unique in the way that they spend more time, they're more likely to spend more time working closely with the founders. So they might learn from them, they might access their social capital, or even just develop personal relationships. So job seekers, they don't only care about startups as a company, but they also care about the quality of the founders who they're going to be working very closely with. So this is a very different setting compared to other studies of signaling, where mostly they examine cases where multiple signals convey one underlying attribute, which is often termed quality. But in our case, it's multiple attributes potentially being signaled by one information. And then we utilize a series of controlled experiments and then propose a method for examining which of the attribute that is being signaled by specific information.
It is extremely important what you say, and you shift what we were used to studying the success of ventures and mainly focusing on the founders' point of view, and you shift actually the discussion to the job seekers and employee recruitment processes. So can you do you remember this moment, or the Eureka moment, when you had this idea, how it came up, like to shift and to say the importance of job seekers on the employees in this and the success of the ventures? Can you remember where this idea of research came from?
Yes, I do, because this research was a part of my PhD thesis, and Simon, my co-author, was my advisor. So I remember very clearly how I got this idea. So the idea for this paper came from two just personal observations. So one observation was that whenever I kind of watched entrepreneurs make pitch presentations or read about a startup in the magazine or the news, they seem to be talking a great deal about their backgrounds, so especially about how they graduated from these prestigious schools and how they used to work for well-known firms like Google or Goldman Sachs. And I found that they were putting so much emphasis on this. And I found that sometimes they would spend more than 5 minutes in a 10-minute pitch presentation just talking about their background. Or the media would highlight startups that, to me, the only catch seemed to be that the founders were ex-Goldman Sachs bankers, or they used to be ex-McKinsey consultants. So that really, got me thinking, well, like, what does that mean? Why should I care that you went to Harvard or you used to work for Goldman Sachs? Why is that important? So that I had that question kind of at the back of my head for a while. And then another observation that I made when I first started my PhD is when I looked around and just talked with the entrepreneurs around me, with my parents and some friends, they weren't really concerned with raising money. So fundraising wasn't at the top of their priority list. So instead, the biggest source of perhaps stress, or the element that they found the most challenging, seemed to be around finding talent, recruiting talent, and then managing human resources. But then when I kind of looked through the scholarly research, especially in entrepreneurship, I realized that most of the research on, let's say, resource acquisition have been conducted in the context of acquiring financial resources. And unfortunately, how entrepreneurs hire talent, how they acquire human resources and then manage them, they remain very much understudied. So I thought just combining these two would be a great way for me to kind of investigate a question that I'm personally curious about and personally interested in, while also contributing to research, but staying relevant for the practice at the same time. So that's what really got me into this particular paper.
This is great observation, and also thank you for sharing this how this idea started. And actually, after this paper, can you share us where do you think the future of research is going? Do you have any ongoing project you are working on for advancing this idea, or you didn't have explored some directions probably you would like to share with us?
Yeah, so I think this paper can open doors to several interesting research streams. And I think the first one will be around how entrepreneurs can recruit talent, because while there is a rather large literature on human resource management and recruitment, most of that research is conducted in the context of large, these corporate firms. And we know relatively little about startups and entrepreneurs and how they recruit uh, people and manage their human resources. And when I kind of talk to some of the people who work for startups versus having corporate careers, I realized that these two are very different. And some of the scarce research suggests that labor market for startups and corporate firms, they're very different in that we should almost treat them as separate. So I think this area of employee recruitment, but in the context of startups, is going to be very interesting to study. And fortunately, I think several scholars have realized this and have recently published several articles that examine this particular topic of recruitment and human resources in the context of entrepreneurial firm. But I think it's still a very young and growing field that has potential for many interesting research projects. And I think another interesting idea or field is a group of individuals called joiners, or these are the people who work for startups as paid employees. Yeah, because one of the things I learned from this research, again, like I mentioned before, is that working for a startup is very different from working for a large and established firm. And when we look at traditional entrepreneurship research, the occupational choice has been thought of as rather being like a dichotomous choice. You're either an entrepreneur or you're a wage employee. But I believe that working for a startup kind of can provide an opportunity for individuals to experience a little bit of both worlds. So a little bit of entrepreneurship, but also mixed with some characteristics of wage employment at the same time. So to me, the choice is, rather than it being a dichotomous, it should be considered as more of a continuum. And I find joiners, this particular group, very interesting because it combines elements of both entrepreneurship and paid employment. And I really hope to conduct more research around this particular group and their experience and some implications of working for startups as paid employees.
This is very inspiring. And actually, I see a lot of implications also how we can apply, because this is also, you change the perspectives of study and stressing like the importance of employee recruitment for startups. So can you please share with us some advices on how probably startups can use your findings, or probably policymakers could use and implement and like change their managerial practices, or probably the process of hiring or identify these talents to continue to have the success of startups?
I'm really glad that you asked this question, because one of the things I really wanted to ensure was that it stayed relevant to practitioners as well, and it offers something to the practitioners. And I think one implication of our paper is around the value of obtaining prestigious affiliations. Because recently there has been some debate about the usefulness of obtaining such credentials. And I saw on LinkedIn that some argue that things like Ivy League education or degrees are only useful for people if you're trying to pursue a career or a corporate career in paid employment. And they argue that if you're planning to pursue entrepreneurship, then degrees from prestigious schools are pretty much useless because you're not going to be using them to get jobs. Well, one of our findings is that we show that there are indeed benefits of obtaining prestigious credentials, even for entrepreneurs. So even if you're planning to become an entrepreneur, there are some benefits of going out, working hard, and obtaining these degrees, as these credentials allow entrepreneurs to attract talent and even save some money while doing so. And another interesting finding and related implication is that we found that the benefits or the effects of these credentials, they disappear in cases where there was more information about the founder, which conveyed their competence. So what this suggests is that those who don't have these prestigious credentials, well, it's not the end of the world. They can actually overcome this disadvantage by acquiring and sharing other types of personal achievements that can really convey their quality and their competence. And this can include things like attending and hopefully placing in a case competition and having some entrepreneurship experience, among other things. And finally, one thing I think is very relevant for practitioners is that we found that these credentials were effective for attracting young job seekers, but not so much for attracting older job seekers who have more experience. So in fact, we found that for these more experienced job seekers, it was really about having relevant work experience that was considered important. And this shows that there is some significant difference in how young and more experienced job seekers evaluate startups. And this means that entrepreneurs, although it might require additional work, but should really try to tailor their recruiting effort depending on the type of employees that they're hoping to recruit into the firm. So those, I would say, are the main implications for practitioners.
Thank you very much, Danny, for this insightful research and for sharing your insights with us today and this inspiring discussion. I would also like to take the opportunity to encourage our readers to download your paper from the website of Springer and continue this discussion to extend our knowledge on this topic. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.